The paper didn't feel like paper. It felt like a verdict. It arrived not by mail, but by the hand of a young man in a cheap suit who couldn't meet his eyes. The crisp envelope, a stark white flag of surrender against the dark, weathered skin of Samuel Jones's hand. He didn't need to read the legalese, the labyrinth of clauses and statutes. He understood the language of invasion. He had seen it before, half a world away, in the dust and smoke of a city under siege. This was just a different kind of siege, fought with letterheads and deadlines instead of rifles and mortars. The letter said the land wasn't his. It said the little patch of green he had carved out of Baltimore's unforgiving concrete plot he'd christened the Hope Garden belonged to Thorn Development. It said in 30 days they would break ground on a new luxury condominium complex. It said he was a trespasser. Sam stood in the middle of his garden, the summons trembling slightly in his grip. 75 years had etched themselves onto his face, but his back was still straight, a ramrod of discipline forged in the crucible of Paris Island. His hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were steady. These were the hands that had cleared jammed rifles in the middle of a firefight, the hands that had carried wounded brothers through fields of fire. Now, they held a piece of paper that threatened to take the only peace he had ever known. This garden was his final redoubt. For a decade, it had been a forgotten lot, a graveyard of broken bottles, rusted car parts, and the city's apathy. Sam had changed that. He'd cleared the debris with his own 2 hands, trucked in soil, and laid irrigation lines. He had planted seeds, and life had answered. Now, rows of collard greens, tomatoes, and okra stood like disciplined soldiers, a vibrant green army pushing back against the gray decay of the inner city. A burst of laughter erupted from the far side of the garden. 2 small kids, a brother and sister from the apartment block next door, were chasing each other through a sprinkler Sam had jury-rigged from an old hose. Their joy was a sound more precious to him than any metal. This wasn't just his garden, it was theirs. It was the only patch of green grass for 6 square blocks, a sanctuary where kids could be kids without the ghosts of sirens in the background. It was where Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street got fresh tomatoes for her salsa, where old Mr. Henderson came to sit on the bench and feel the sun on his face. Thorn Development saw a prime real estate opportunity. Sam saw a promise he'd made to the ghosts he carried. The ghosts of young men who never got to see 20, let alone 75. Men who had died in the rubble-strewn streets of Hue City during the Tet Offensive of '68. He had promised them he would live a life worthy of their sacrifice. He would build something, not destroy it. He would cultivate life, not just witness death. The summons felt heavier now. The corporate logo of Thorn Development seemed to sneer at him. He knew who Marcus Thorn was. Everyone did. A man who built glass towers that cast long shadows over neighborhoods like this. A man whose smile on magazine covers never quite reached his eyes. To men like Thorn, a man like Sam Jones was invisible, a relic, a piece of the old world to be swept aside for the new. They didn't see a Marine. They saw an old black man standing in the way of progress. He walked back to his small row house, the screen door groaning a familiar complaint. The house was immaculate, Spartan. Everything had a place. It was the only way he could keep the chaos of his memories at bay. In the living room, above the mantelpiece, was a single framed photograph. It wasn't of family, he had none left. It was a picture of a dozen young men in combat fatigues, faces smeared with grime and exhaustion, huddled together in the ruins of a building. They were Marines, his brothers. Most of them in the photo never made it out of Hue. Sam didn't need a lawyer. Lawyers fought with words, and he knew this battle wouldn't be won with words alone. It would be won with truth. He went to the closet in his bedroom and pulled down a heavy wooden box. It smelled of cedar and thyme. He ran his hand over the lid, tracing the faint outline of the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem he had carved into it 50 years ago. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was his past. His dress blue uniform, perfectly preserved. A stack of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. And in the center, a small, separate compartment. He lifted the lid. There it was, the silver star. It wasn't shiny. He never polished it. To him, it wasn't a trophy. It was a grave marker that you could hold in your hand. It was a testament to a single, horrific day in a city of stone and death. It was the weight of the man he'd tried to save, the heat of the fire, the taste of blood and cordite in his mouth. It was a covenant, a silent promise between him and the men who didn't come home. He picked it up. The metal was cold against his skin. For years, he had kept it locked away, a private burden. But Thorne and his lawyers were bringing the war to his doorstep. They were trying to take his last piece of ground. A Marine never cedes his ground without a fight. He wouldn't go to that courtroom as a victim. He wouldn't go as a trespasser. He would go as what he was. Gunnery Sergeant Samuel Jones, United States Marine Corps, retired. He took his old, service-worn blazer from the closet, the closest thing he had to a suit. With deliberate, precise movements, he pinned the silver star to the lapel, right over his heart. It sat there, a quiet, defiant glint of silver against the dark blue fabric. The summons lay on the kitchen table, a declaration of war. Sam looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw the gray in his hair, the lines on his face. But he also saw the ghost of the young man from the photograph, the Marine in his eyes who never really left. The battle for the Hope Garden had begun, and he was ready. The Baltimore City Circuit Courthouse was designed to inspire awe, with soaring marble columns and ceilings so high they seemed to gather shadows. But for those who stood on the wrong side of a summons, it was just an arena, and the air hummed with the quiet tension of impending combat. On one side of the battlefield sat the invading force. Marcus Thorne, CEO of Thorne Development, looked less like a litigant and more like a man observing a mildly inconvenient business transaction. He wore a suit that cost more than Sam's entire monthly income, his perfectly coiffed hair and dismissive smirk a uniform of corporate power. To him, this hearing was a formality, a rubber stamp on the march of progress. Beside him was his weapon, David Chen. Young, sharp, and hungry, David was a rising star at a prestigious downtown law firm. His briefcase was filled with surveys, deeds, and legal precedents, each one a perfectly cited round, ready to be fired. He saw this case as a stepping stone, a clean, simple property dispute that would impress the partners and solidify his relationship with a client like Thorne. He glanced at the old man sitting alone on the opposite bench, a flicker of something pity, perhaps crossing his mind before he suppressed it. Pity didn't win cases, and presiding over it all, from his elevated throne of polished mahogany, was Judge Arthur Sterling. He was a man carved from granite, his face a mask of judicial neutrality that failed to hide the coldness in his eyes. For 20 years, he had run his courtroom with an iron gavel. He despised theatrics, loathed emotional appeals, and held a particular, unspoken contempt for defendants who wore their life stories on their sleeves. His chamber walls were bare, except for his diplomas, and a single, stark, black and white photograph of a young man in a Marine Corps officer's uniform, his brother, a ghost that haunted the edges of every judgment he delivered. The courtroom was fuller than usual for a civil hearing. A local news reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, who'd gotten a tip about the case, had set up a small camera in the back. She sensed a David and Goliath story, the lone black veteran versus the titan of industry. Her presence added a new layer of pressure to the room, turning the legal proceeding into a public spectacle. When the bailiff called case 734, Thorne Development versus Jones, Sam stood and walked toward the witness stand. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, his footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. He didn't look at Thorne or his lawyer. He didn't look at the judge. He focused on a point on the far wall, a technique he'd learned long ago for navigating treacherous ground. As he settled into the witness chair, a collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. The silver star on his lapel caught the harsh fluorescent light, a beacon of defiance in the sterile room. David Chen felt a strange jolt. It wasn't just a medal. It was that medal. He'd seen it in books, in documentaries. It signified valor of the highest degree. An uneasy feeling began to coil in his stomach. This wasn't as simple as the file suggested. Marcus Thorne leaned over and whispered to David, a venomous edge to his voice. "Look at this clown. Think he can win a jury with a trinket? Bury him." But it was Judge Sterling who reacted most viscerally. His eyes, which had been scanning the docket, locked onto the piece of metal on Sam's chest. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He saw not a symbol of sacrifice, but a boast. A gaudy declaration from a man who had lived, while others better men, his brother, had not. The cold neutrality of his expression fractured, revealing the bedrock of resentment beneath. He let the silence stretch, his gaze a physical weight pressing down on Sam. This was his arena, and he would not tolerate a challenge to his authority. "Mr. Jones." Judge Sterling's voice cut through the silence, sharp and thin as a shard of glass. Sam raised his head, his gaze meeting the judge's. "Before we proceed," Sterling continued, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the silver star, "you will remove that object from your jacket." The command hung in the air, absolute and cold. A nervous cough broke the stillness in the gallery. David Chen felt a prickle of alarm. This was not standard procedure. This was personal. Sarah Jenkins, the reporter in the back, instinctively tightened her grip on her camera, sensing the story was taking a sharp, unexpected turn. Sam did not move. His hand, resting on the wooden rail of the witness box, curled into a loose fist. He had been given orders by shouting, terrified lieutenants and calm, seasoned captains. He had obeyed orders that sent him into the jaws of death. But this order felt different. It was not a command given in the heat of battle, but a calculated act of diminishment. The judge's lips thinned into a bloodless line. He was not accustomed to being ignored. "Let me be clearer, Mr. Jones," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone that carried more threat than a shout. "This is a court of law, not a stage for military theatrics. We are not here to be impressed by your past exploits. We are here to adjudicate a matter of property law. We have no time, nor do we have the means, to verify the authenticity of such decorations, which, for all this court knows, could be purchased from any number of online novelty shops." A collective gasp went through the room. The insult was breathtaking in its cruelty. To suggest the silver star, a medal earned in blood and terror, was a cheap trinket was a desecration. Marcus Thorne smirked, a look of vindicated pleasure on his face. This was better than he could have hoped for. Sam's expression remained unchanged, a stoic mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His silence was not born of defiance, but of a deep, abiding sorrow. He was being asked to strip himself of the only thing that connected him to the men he'd lost. The judge, sensing the courtroom's sympathy shifting away from him, decided to end it. He would reassert his dominance in a way no one could misinterpret. "Bailiff." Sterling's voice cracked like a whip. A uniformed officer, a burly man whose face showed his own discomfort, hesitated for a second before stepping forward. "Assist Mr. Jones in complying with the court's directive," the judge commanded, his voice dripping with ice. "Remove the object." The courtroom fell into a horrified hush. This was no longer a request. It was a public shaming. The bailiff approached the witness stand, his hand outstretched, his expression apologetic. "Sir, please," he began softly. The camera in the back of the room was rolling, capturing every agonizing second. The bailiff reaching, the old man's stillness, the judge's cold, unyielding face. But before the bailiff's hand could touch him, Sam acted. He would not give them the satisfaction of taking it from him. With a swift, almost violent motion, he reached up, his own fingers fumbling for the pin. He tore the metal from his jacket. The clasp ripped a small hole in the old fabric. He didn't place it down gently. He slammed it onto the wooden ledge of the witness box. Crack. The sound was not the soft clink of metal on wood. It was sharp, explosive, like a distant rifle shot. It was the sound of something precious being broken. The silver star lay there, stark and alone, a gleaming piece of history stripped of its context, its dignity violated under the cold glare of the courtroom lights. Sam folded his hands in his lap, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on nothing, his face a mask of iron control. But in the rigid set of his shoulders, the entire courtroom could feel the tremor of a man whose honor had just been publicly flayed. A suffocating silence clung to the courtroom. Judge Sterling, having asserted his dominance, gestured curtly to David Chen. "Proceed, counselor." David rose, the legal papers in his hand feeling slick with sweat. The calculated cruelty he had just witnessed had unsettled him, turning what should have been a straightforward examination into something fraught and ugly. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Jones, could you state for the record how long you have occupied the property at 112 West Preston Street?" "The house, since 1975. Sam's voice was low and raspy, the sound of gravel grinding over stone. "The lot next to it. I started clearing that ground 10 years ago." "And you were aware that the lot was not part of your deeded property?" David asked, his voice betraying a hint of his own discomfort. "I was aware it belonged to no one," Sam replied, his eyes still fixed on the far wall. "It was a forgotten place, a wound in the neighborhood. I tried to heal it." As he spoke, the sterile courtroom began to fade from his mind, replaced by images far more vivid. The words "forgotten place" and "wound" transported him back 50 years, to a city of stone half a world away. Hue City, 1968. The ancient citadel, once a place of serene beauty, was now a labyrinth of death. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and decay. Every street was a killing field, every shattered building a potential sniper's nest. His platoon, part of the 1st Battalion, the 5th of Marchins, was tasked with clearing a sector near the Perfume River. It was house-to-house, room-to-room combat, a brutal, intimate form of warfare that left no soul untouched. "Mr. Jones," David pressed on, trying to pull the testimony back to the dry facts of the case. "The plaintiff, Thorn Development, holds a clear title to that lot, purchased from the city in a public auction. Did you ever attempt to purchase the land yourself?" "Men like me don't have the money to buy land in this city, counselor," Sam said simply. "We just have the time to mend it." He remembered the men, young faces, barely out of their teens, all trying to act tougher than they were. He remembered a kid from Alabama they called Bama, who was always talking about the farm he was going to buy. He remembered a corporal from Chicago who could quote Shakespeare. And he remembered their commanding officer, a young, untested captain, whose ambition often outpaced his judgment. David Chen felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The cadence of Sam's voice, the stoic way he held himself under pressure, it stirred a deep, forgotten memory. He thought of his father, a quiet, reserved man who rarely spoke of his own service as a South Korean officer attached to the American forces in Vietnam. But on the rare occasions he did, after a few drinks on the anniversary of his best friend's death, he would talk about one man, a Black Marine gunnery sergeant, a lion, his father had called him. Sam, the man who never retreated. The name echoed in David's mind. Sam. He glanced down at the case file. Samuel L. Jones. A cold dread began to creep up his spine. It couldn't be. The odds were astronomical. He looked at the old man in the witness box, really looked at him for the first Timino as an obstacle, but as a man. He saw the quiet strength, the unyielding posture. It was the same posture he saw in the one grainy black and white photograph his father kept in a worn leather wallet. The photograph of his unit. In the center stood a formidable-looking Black Marine sergeant. His heart hammered against his ribs. The courtroom, the case, Marcus Thorne's smug face it all receded. Suddenly, this wasn't about a piece of land anymore. It was about a debt his family had carried for half a century. And he was on the wrong side of the ledger. "Your Honor, may we have a brief recess?" David Chen's voice was strained, unfamiliar even to himself. Judge Sterling glared down, annoyed by the interruption. "On what grounds, counselor?" "I need a moment to confer with my client," David stammered, his mind racing. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The air in the courtroom felt thick as mud. Sterling gave a dismissive wave. 5 minutes. Don't waste the court's time." As soon as the judge declared the recess, David bolted from the courtroom, ignoring Marcus Thorne's hissed, "What the hell are you doing?" He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. He found his father's number in his contacts and pressed call, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He paced the echoing marble hallway, praying his father would pick up. "David? Is everything all right?" His father's voice, accented and gentle, came through the line from 3,000 miles away in California. "Dad," David said, his voice tight. "I'm in court, in Baltimore, the man my client is suing. His name is Samuel Jones. He's a Marine veteran." There was a silence on the other end of the line. A silence so profound David could hear the static hum of the connection. "What did you say his name was?" his father asked, his voice suddenly sharp, stripped of its usual calm. "Samuel Jones. Dad, he was in Hue. In 68. The silence stretched longer this time. When his father finally spoke, his voice was a choked whisper. Is he a tall man? Even now, does he stand like a mountain that will not move?" Tears pricked David's eyes. "Yes, Dad. That's him." A ragged breath came through the phone. "David," his father said, the word heavy with unspoken history. "That man carried me on his back for 2 kilometers through a city on fire. A sniper's bullet had shattered my leg. He refused to leave me. He saved my life, your life. It began because he did not give up on mine. You owe that man everything." The line went quiet, but the words hung in the air, a judgment more powerful than any Judge Sterling could ever deliver. "You owe that man everything." David leaned against the cold marble wall, the phone slipping from his grasp. The world had just tilted on its axis. His ambition, the partnership track, the approval of men like Marcus Thornite all turned to ash in his mouth. He was the son of a man saved by a hero, and he had been hired to destroy that hero. He was using the law, the very system he had sworn to uphold, to dishonor his family's savior. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness rising in his gut. When Marcus Thorne stormed out into the hallway, his face a mask of rage, David barely registered him. "What is wrong with you, Chen?" Thorne snarled. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Get back in there and finish him." David looked at Thorne, truly saw him for the first time, the entitlement, the predatory greed, the utter lack of humanity. The man wasn't just trying to take a piece of land. He was trying to erase a man's dignity. Something inside David snapped. He walked back into the courtroom, his purpose reset. He was no longer Marcus Thorne's weapon. He was his father's son. His steps were firm, his back straight. He picked up his legal pad, but he wasn't looking at his prepared questions. He was looking for the truth. He stood before the witness stand, and this time, he met Sam Jones's eyes directly. "Mr. Jones," he began, his voice clear and steady, all tremor gone. "I want to return to your service. You were with the 1st Battalion, the 5th of Marchings in Hue City, is that correct?" A flicker of surprise crossed Sam's face. Judge Sterling leaned forward, a frown deepening on his face. "Counselor, where is this line of questioning going?" "To establish the character of the witness, Your Honor," David said, his gaze unwavering, "and its relevance will become abundantly clear. Please, Mr. Jones, tell the court about your unit." Judge Arthur Sterling watched the proceedings with a growing, acidic resentment. The shift in his courtroom was palpable. The young, ambitious lawyer was no longer attacking. He was showcasing. And the old man in the witness box, the man Sterling had tried to reduce to a nameless defendant, was beginning to command the room with his quiet, unshakable dignity. It infuriated him. Every mention of the Marine Corps, every reference to Hue, was a personal affront. For Sterling, Vietnam wasn't a historical event. It was a wound that had never healed, a gaping hole in his family where his older brother used to be. That night, long after the court had adjourned for the day, Sterling sat alone in his chambers. The city lights of Baltimore twinkled outside his window, but he didn't see them. He saw only the reflection in the dark glass, a tired man in a judge's robe, haunted by a ghost in dress blues. He opened a locked drawer in his mahogany desk and removed a thin, worn leather box. Inside was a purple heart and a neatly folded American flag, the one that had draped his brother's coffin. He also pulled out a small stack of letters, their envelopes brittle with age, tied with a faded ribbon. They were the last letters he'd ever received from his brother, Captain Daniel Sterling, USMC. Daniel had been everything Arthur was not: charismatic, athletic, a natural leader. He had been the golden son, destined for greatness. Arthur, the quiet, bookish younger brother, had always lived in his shadow, admiring and resenting him in equal measure. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the last letter. The paper was so thin it was almost translucent. Daniel's handwriting, usually so bold and confident, was tight and agitated. "Artie," it began, "something's not right here. We got a new CO for the company, a Captain Thorne. He's got friends in high places, I hear. All swagger, no substance. The man looks at a map like it's written in a foreign language. He talks a big game, but the men don't trust him. I don't trust him. He's going to get good Marines killed. He almost did last week on a pointless patrol. I had to argue him down from walking us straight into an NVA machine gun nest. He called it insubordination. I called it common sense. Pray for us, little brother. This place is hard enough without having to fight your own command." 2 weeks after that letter arrived, 2 Marines in immaculate dress uniforms had appeared on his family's doorstep. They had spoken of his brother's heroism, of his sacrifice. The official report stated that Captain Daniel Sterling had died while leading a valiant charge against a heavily fortified enemy position, a hero's death. But Arthur had always clutched the secret doubt fostered by that last letter. He'd pictured his perfect, brilliant brother dying not for a noble cause, but because of the incompetence of a man named Thorne. Over the years, that doubt had curdled into a specific, poisonous brand of bitterness. He harbored a deep, unacknowledged rage against the men who came home, the survivors. The ones who got medals, who got to grow old, who got to sit in his courtroom and wear their survival like a badge of honor while his perfect brother lay in Arlington. He looked at the news clip on his computer screen. The local station had already posted the video from the courtroom. It showed Sam Jones, his face a granite mask of dignity. It showed the silver star hitting the wood. The headline read, "Local veteran humiliated in court by judge." A surge of sick satisfaction went through him. He hadn't just humiliated a defendant. He had, in some small, twisted way, struck a blow against the ghosts of all the survivors. He had taken one of their gaudy symbols and thrown it on the ground. He shut the laptop. Let them call him a monster. They didn't understand. They couldn't possibly understand the weight of a folded flag. The next morning, an undeniable tension crackled in the courtroom. The gallery was packed. Sarah Jenkins's news story had exploded overnight, shared thousands of times across veterans' forums and social media. The video of Sam's humiliation was a viral firestorm. People weren't just here for a property dispute anymore. They were here for a reckoning. David Chen felt the weight of every stare. He had spent a sleepless night on the phone with his firm's senior partners, who were apoplectic about his rogue line of questioning. Marcus Thorne, seated beside him, vibrated with a silent, furious energy, his face pale with rage. He had given David a direct order. Drop this, stick to the property line, win the case. But David couldn't turn back. The image of his father's face, etched with a 50-year-old debt of gratitude, was burned into his mind. He had a duty that superseded any contract with Thorne Development. When Judge Sterling called the court to order, his face was even more severe than usual, a mask of grim authority. He looked as if he were daring anyone to challenge him. David rose, his hands steady. He had found his resolve in the long hours of the night. He would not be intimidated. "Mr. Jones," David began, his voice resonating with a newfound confidence. "Yesterday, we were discussing your unit in Hue City. Can you tell the court about the command structure? Who is your company commander?" Marcus Thorne shot to his feet. "Objection! Irrelevant! This is a deliberate and unprofessional diversion from the case at hand." "Sustained," Judge Sterling snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "Counselor, I will not warn you again. Confine your questions to the matter of the property." David didn't flinch. He held the judge's gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it is not a diversion. It goes to the very heart of why we are here." He turned back to Sam. "Mr. Jones, let me rephrase. The actions for which you were awarded the Silver Star, were they performed during the push to retake the southern wall of the Citadel?" Sam nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "They were. And was a Captain Daniel Sterling present during that engagement?" The name struck the room like a physical blow. Judge Sterling froze, his gavel hand hovering in midair. His face went white, a stark contrast to his black robes. The carefully constructed wall of judicial impartiality crumbled into dust, revealing the raw, wounded man beneath. He looked at David as if he had just been stabbed. "Counselor," the judge's voice was a strangled whisper. "What did you say?" Marcus Thorne looked back and forth between the judge and David, a dawning horror on his face. He finally understood the direction David was heading, and it was a place from which there was no return. David ignored them both. His focus was entirely on the man in the witness box. Sam looked up, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time with something other than stoicism. It was a look of profound, shared, and tragic understanding. He knew. In that instant, he knew exactly who the judge was. David pressed on, his voice ringing with purpose, sealing the fate of everyone in the room. "I will ask the question again, Mr. Jones. For the record, for the honor of the men who fell that day, was Captain Daniel Sterling in your unit on the day you earned your medal?" The courtroom was so quiet it felt like a vacuum, every molecule of air sucked out by the gravity of David's last question. Judge Sterling sat paralyzed, his authority gone, replaced by the raw vulnerability of a man about to witness the excavation of his life's deepest wound. Marcus Thorne's face was a mask of disbelief and terror. Sam Jones took a slow, deep breath. The wall he had built around that day, stone by painstaking stone for 50 years, was about to come down. He was no longer just a witness in a property dispute. He was the keeper of a terrible truth. "Yes," Sam said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. Captain Sterling was there. He finally looked away from the far wall and directly at the judge. He was a good officer, one of the best. He cared about his men. His gaze then shifted, slowly, deliberately, until it rested on Marcus Thorne. "But he wasn't our company commander." The air crackled. Every person in the room leaned forward. "Our company commander," Sam continued, His voice, as steady as a drumbeat, was a man named Robert Thorne. Marcus Thorne flinched as if he'd been struck. Lies. This is slander, he choked out, but his voice was thin and reedy, devoid of its usual power. I am under oath, Sam said, his eyes boring into Marcus. The statement was simple, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Tell us what happened, Mr. Jones, David said softly. And Sam did. The words came not in a torrent, but as a slow, painful unwinding. He spoke of the push to retake the southern wall of the citadel, a meat grinder of urban warfare. He described the order given by Captain Robert Thorne. It wasn't a strategic plan. It was a fit of arrogant madness. Thorne had ordered a full platoon to charge directly across a wide, open courtyard, straight into a heavily fortified NVA position, without artillery or air support. It was a suicide run, Sam said, his voice now raspy with memory. Pure and simple. We all knew it. He then described what happened next. Captain Sterling. He was there. He argued with Thorne. I was close enough to hear it. He told him it was a death trap. He pleaded with him to call for suppressive fire, to find another way, to not throw away the lives of his men for nothing. Sam paused, his eyes closing for a moment, as if to block out the image. Captain Thorne? He didn't listen. He called Captain Sterling a coward, in front of the whole platoon. He said he would bring him up on charges for insubordination. Then he gave the order again. Move out. The story hung in the air, a horrifying tableau. The men hesitated, Sam went on. But an order is an order. They went over the wall. The machine guns opened up from 3 different directions. It was a slaughter. Over in minutes. He took another shaky breath. I was with the support element. When the firing slowed, we moved in. It was my job to retrieve who we could. I found Captain Sterling near the far wall. He was still alive. Barely. Tears welled in Sam's eyes, the first crack in his iron facade. I tried to pull him back. He was heavy. The firing started again. He looked at me, and he knew. He said, tell my brother, tell Artie. I tried. Then he was gone. The courtroom was utterly still. Sarah Jenkins's camera was forgotten, its red light blinking unnoticed. The legal dispute over a plot of land had vanished, replaced by the ghost of a 50-year-old war crime. And Captain Thorne? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. He survived, Sam said, a universe of contempt in those 2 words. He stayed behind the wall. Later, he wrote the official report. He said Captain Sterling died leading a heroic charge that he himself had ordered. He made your brother a hero, Your Honor, to cover up the fact that he had murdered him, that he had murdered all of them. Sam finally fell silent. The truth, unearthed from the rubble of his memory, lay bare in the center of the courtroom. Judge Arthur Sterling stared at Sam, his face a ruin. The man he had humiliated, the man he had resented for simply surviving, was the last person to hear his brother's voice. The man whose son was suing this veteran was the man who had sent his brother to his death. The world had not just tilted. It had shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The silence that followed Sam's testimony was a living thing. It was heavier than stone, filled with the ghosts of dead Marines and the wreckage of 3 men's lives. Judge Arthur Sterling did not move. He sat on his high-backed chair, no longer a figure of authority, but a man impaled by the truth. His face was a canvas of shock, grief, and a dawning, soul-crushing shame. He looked from Sam's weary, honorable face to Marcus Thorne's, which had collapsed into a mask of pure panic. The foundation of his life, the heroic martyrdom of his brother, the righteous anger he had nursed for decades should have been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. Marcus Thorne, finally breaking, scrambled to his feet. This is a fabrication, a desperate, pathetic lie from a man trying to keep a piece of land he doesn't own, he shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. But no one was listening. No one was looking at him. Every eye in the room was on the judge and the old Marine. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Judge Sterling reached for his gavel, but he didn't bang it. He just held it, his knuckles white. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again. This court, he managed to rasp, his voice broken. This court is adjourned. He didn't say indefinitely. He didn't say until tomorrow. He just said adjourned. He pushed his chair back, the sound of wood scraping against the floor, a final jarring note. He stood up, unsteady on his feet, and without another look at anyone, he turned and walked, almost stumbled, through the door to his chambers, closing it quietly behind him. The click of the latch was the softest, most definitive sound in the world. It was the sound of a career, a life, ending. The spell was broken. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur that quickly grew into a chaotic buzz. Reporters, who had been held outside, now pushed into the room, their cameras flashing, shouting questions at a stunned Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, is it true your father falsified records? Will Thorne Development be dropping the lawsuit?" Thorne, pale and sweating, shoved his way through the throng, refusing to answer, his escape a portrait of guilt. In the midst of the chaos, David Chen walked calmly to the plaintiff's table. He gathered his files, put them neatly back into his briefcase, and snapped it shut. Then he walked over to the witness stand. The crowd parted for him, sensing the gravity of the moment. He stood before Sam Jones, who had not yet moved from his chair. The silver star still lay on the ledge beside him. David didn't offer a handshake. The gesture felt too small, too inadequate. Instead, he simply bowed his head slightly. "On behalf of my father, Captain Kim," he said, his voice clear and strong enough for Sam to hear over the din, "and on behalf of myself, thank you. And I am so sorry." Sam looked at the young lawyer, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pain crossed his face. It was a faint, weary acknowledgement. He gave a single, slow nod. David turned and walked away, not towards the exit, but towards the reporter, Sarah Jenkins. He spoke to her briefly, his words inaudible to the rest of the room, before leaving the courtroom for good, his back straight, leaving his career and his high-powered law firm behind him without a single glance back. Finally, Sam Jones rose. He was just an old man now, the weight of his testimony having taken its toll. He moved to the witness stand railing, his movement stiff. He reached out and picked up the silver star. He didn't pin it back on. He simply closed his hand around it, the sharp edges of the star pressing into his palm, a familiar, painful comfort. As he turned to leave, an old man in the back of the gallery, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, slowly got to his feet. Then another, and another. Soon, every veteran in the room was standing. They didn't clap, they didn't speak. They just stood in silent, solemn tribute. It was an honor guard, formed spontaneously in the wreckage of a courtroom, for a man who had finally come all the way home. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and seismic. The story of what happened in Courtroom 4B became more than just a local news item. It became a national conversation about honor, memory, and justice. Sarah Jenkins's unedited footage, including Sam's full testimony, was picked up by major networks. The official military records of the engagement at Hue were re-examined by a congressional committee. Thorne Development, facing a PR cataclysm and shareholder revolt, dropped the lawsuit against Samuel Jones and issued a public apology. The company's stock plummeted, and Marcus Thorne quietly resigned from his position as CEO. His father's tarnished legacy now irrevocably fused with his own. Judge Arthur Sterling never returned to the bench. He submitted his resignation for reasons of health and personal matters. There was no formal inquiry, no public sanction. He simply vanished from public life, his career ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating weight of the truth. But Sam Jones paid little attention to the headlines. He had not told his story for fame or retribution. He had told it to honor a debt to a dead captain and to defend his small patch of peace. His life returned to its familiar rhythm, centered around the seasons of his garden. One sunny Saturday, a few months later, Sam was on his knees, pulling weeds from a bed of tomato plants when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see David Chen standing there, not in a suit, but in jeans and a plain t-shirt. He held a pair of gardening gloves in his hand. "I quit the firm," David said simply. "No preamble needed. I'm doing some pro bono work now, for the Veterans Legal Aid Society." Sam nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Good for you." "My father, he wanted me to tell you he's glad you're still a fighter," David said, a small smile on his face. "He also said, if I didn't offer to help you with these weeds, he'd disown me." Sam looked at the young man, then at the long row of tomatoes, and a genuine, slow smile spread across his face for the first time in a very long time. "Grab a spade," he said. "The earth doesn't care about your law degree. They worked together in comfortable silence, the shared rhythm of their labor, a language more profound than words. The garden, which had been a solitary refuge, now felt like a shared victory. It was no longer just his. Later that week, a small, unassuming package arrived in Sam's mailbox. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a simple, elegant shadow box frame made of dark cherry wood. It was empty. Taped to the glass was a small, handwritten note on plain cardstock. The note contained only 8 words. For Captain Daniel Sterling. From his grateful brother. Sam knew instantly who it was from. He took the frame inside and went to the old wooden box in his closet. He took out the silver star. For years, it had been a burden, a reminder of failure and fire. Now, it felt different, lighter. He carefully placed the metal inside the new frame, against the black velvet backing. He hung it on the wall in his living room, not far from the photograph of his platoon. It wasn't a trophy, it was a story, finally told, finally put to rest. He sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over the city. The sounds of children playing in the Hope Garden drifted on the warm air. He thought of the Marine Corps motto, the 2 words that had defined his life. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. He had been faithful to his country, faithful to his brothers, and, for 50 long years, faithful to a secret that was not his to keep. He had finally fulfilled his last duty to a fallen captain. The weight was gone. Gunnery Sergeant Samuel Jones, retired, sat in the fading light, at peace in his final redoubt. The war, at long last, was over.